Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm Leslie Smith, Director of the Materials Science and Engineering Laboratory here at NIST. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to what promises to be an exciting story, a story about what science can tell us about what was one of certainly the most visible advanced technology expressions of the early part of this 20th century. The story is going to be told by Dr. Tim Foecke, a researcher here in our metallurgy division. He's going to talk about 45 minutes, after which there'll be a question and answer period with the audience. After the evening is over, those of you who wish will have an opportunity to come up here on the stage and look at, and in some cases actually touch, some of the artifacts that were brought up from the ocean floor that Tim will be telling us about. A little background on Dr. Foecke. He got his bachelor's and PhD degree in materials science from the University of Minnesota, and he joined us here as postdoctoral associate in 1991. He joined our technical staff in 1993, and he's been interested in how the structure of metals really determines how far that they can be bent or stretched before they tear. This kind of information is useful to automobile manufacturers, for example, that have to take large sheets of metal and stamp them into automobile bodies. He's also been interested in some of the more a newer branch of science called nanomaterials, and he's been interested in the explanation of why metals become extremely small or extremely strong when the crystals that make up the metal become reduced in size to the orders of tens of atoms. It seems like a long distance between these kind of research interests and the work that Dr. Foecke is going to tell us about tonight, and maybe we'll get a little bit of an explanation as to how he got dragged from these research interests into what is a compelling story about the sinking of the Titanic. So please welcome Dr. Tim Foecke.
I want to thank Les for the nice introduction and for having you all here this evening so I can describe some of the things we've been working on with regard to the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic is obviously one of the most famous disasters that ever occurred. At the time, it was considered to be the pinnacle of technological development. It sank on its maiden voyage containing a large number of quite famous people. And it was a shock to the core of culture that something that had been designed to be quote-unquote unsinkable, only described that way by the press, could go down after a relatively minor impact with an iceberg. And what I'm going to describe to you is the scientific study that has been going on over the last 3 years to try and determine the details of what happened to the Titanic during the sinking, how she sank, and also what has been happening to her since she's been on the bottom. And this is just a partial list of members of a panel that I belong to called the Marine Forensics Panel for the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. It's made up of about 80 people, including naval architects, marine engineers, metallurgists, lawyers, historians, all of whom are involved in trying to solve the mystery of the sinking of the Titanic. In this particular case, some of these people, the chairman of our panel, other metallurgists I've worked with, George Tulloch, who's actually the person who owns the salvage rights to the Titanic, people from the Discovery Channel who have been documenting quite a lot of the work as we've been going along, and other people who have provided metallurgical and historical and other information to us. Every time a new class of ship is run out, it is given a big write-up in this journal called The Shipbuilder, which is published in England. In this case, the summer of 1911. This was an article that was put out on the Olympic, which was the first of 3 of the Olympic class, the Titanic being the second. During the time that this was put out, Titanic had not just sunk, but this was already in press, so the details of it were not included in this article. Just to give you an idea of how big Titanic was for her day, This shows the relative size of various passenger liners as you go from the 1870s up through 1910, and this is Olympic and Titanic here. And it's interesting to note during this time, the ships started out being made with plain old iron, and there was a transition to making ships out of steel, which is an alloy of iron and carbon. And there's an awful lot of learning that went on trying to adopt steel versus iron in making these ships because they have different properties. But you see that the ship was about a third larger than any ship that had been made previously. And I'm going to go a little bit into the background of her construction and show you some pictures. This gives you an idea of the scale of this ship. There's some guys standing on the shafts of the propellers. Titanic weighed 46,000 tons. She was the largest man-made moving object. When you stand her on her tail, she was 882 feet long, and she was as tall as the Empire State Building. She was made up of some 3,000 plates of mild steel, held together with some 3 million wrought iron rivets. And some of the production steps they had to go through, you take plates such as these and run them through. This is a steam-driven punch that puts 1-inch rivet holes down the edge of the plate, and you pre-measure all these things and take it all down to the works and assemble it. This is a significant finding here. This wingding here is a hydraulic riveter. What you have is, think of it as a large pair of needle-nose pliers. What you have is a rivet coming out of the furnace here, being inserted in the hole. There's a piston that expands up here, that's a hinge, and it squeezes the rivet into place. These devices were used to ensure consistent riveting, and they were actually invented for building the Olympic class of ships. This is an important thing that I'll come back to, as it has an impact on the rivet findings that we have. This is Olympic being put together. You see that she has a double bottom. There's one layer here and there's another down here. You see all the guys putting in rivets. There's 1, 2 hydraulic riveters operating, and you see the frame from the stern starting to come together. And when you look later at some of the corrosion that I'm going to show you and some of the pictures of what Titanic looks like now under the ocean, keep in mind this picture where you see how massive the structure was. Look at the size of these I-beams and these floors. This is the promenade, which is an open walking area on some of the upper decks on Titanic. And you see how unbelievably large amounts of steel went into building Titanic. These are the much vaunted watertight doors. These were an innovation on the Olympic class ships and a few other ships also to try and compartmentalize, to make separate sections in the ship so that if you got damage and flooding in one, it wouldn't spread to others. And this could be tripped either electrically through this wire, or this is a little float, kind of think of it like a toilet tank, where if water would fill up here, the floor, when it gets put in, is right there. When the water would come up, it would trip this switch and the door would fall automatically. And when you put the ship together, you simply lay up plates along the side, and you have the hydraulic riveter come along, and you lay it like bricks on the side of a house. Now, there have been a number of very interesting controversies that have come up during the course of our investigation. It's usually naval architects against historians. The naval architects and the engineers wanted to simulate how strong a rivet was. To simulate how strong a rivet was, we had to know what was the shape of the head. Did the head come down and make a taper, or did it come down and make a square angle with the head? Very large differences in the strength. We were trying to figure out, what do the rivets look like below the waterline? Well, the naval architect said, you make rivets below the waterline flush so that there's no drag, so the ship can go faster. The historian said, the White Star Line never went for speed. They went for luxury. So they didn't care what the rivets looked like below the waterline. Well, then we found this picture, which is looking underneath Olympic while she was being built, looking toward the stern. That's the rudder right there. And you can see these heads are sticking out. And so we were able to determine that, indeed, it did not have flush heads, and the historians won one. When these plates are put on, most of the joints on Titanic are lap joints. A lap joint is where you have 2 plates that are overlapping like this, with multiple rows of rivets holding them together. Another possible joint is a butt joint, where you bring them together like this with a beam in the back, and rivet them through. So if you have a lap joint, you have a step on the side of the ship. So the ship is not smooth. And this is a picture showing that. You see these 1-inch steps from the plates all over the place. And it's supposed to be leaking. That's bilge water. But for as massive as she was also appeared to be remarkably fragile. The ship was 92 feet wide. And this is a half-section, cross-section of the ship. The ship is 92 feet wide, but the hull is only 1 inch thick. So if you divide those two distances, it's actually smaller than that for an eggshell. Of course, the 737 has a similar characteristic. Everything was just fine until Titanic encountered, arguably, this iceberg. This picture was taken by the McKay Bennett the day after the disaster while she was out recovering bodies and debris. And the Titanic sank in 2.5 hours in the North Atlantic. In 1985, using information from a number of sources, including the National Geographic Society, Bob Ballard found Titanic in 12,600 feet of water off the Grand Banks, 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland. And since then, it has been explored extensively by people from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and also from the people who are currently the salvors in possession of the ship. And I have a little video to show you some footage that has not been broadcast before from the last expedition in August 1998. This is presented courtesy of the Discovery Channel and also RMS Titanic Incorporated. This is what she looks like today. This is the bow of Titanic. The two sections of the ship are resting in 12,000 feet of water, approximately 3/4 of a mile apart, pointing in opposite directions. You see the surface of the ship is coated in what they call rusticles, which I'll explain in detail a little bit later. It's corroding at a very high rate. Our microbiologist estimates that the ship is being turned into rusticle at the rate of 1 ton per day, so that the ship will be completely digested within 75 years. And because of the way various decks are collapsing and there's stress at certain points which corrode even faster, the ship will probably collapse in upon itself within the next 20 years. There were significant increases in damage between the footage that was filmed in 1986, which was the last, 1987, which was the last Woods Hole expedition, and 2 years ago and this year. Much more than any of the naval architects expected to have happened. This is a fly along the bow. You saw the anchor chains. This is coming up toward the forward cargo hold hatch, which is missing. This last expedition, there was a plan to send a baby ROV called T-Rex down through this, 5 decks down, to try and photograph the damage from the iceberg collision from the inside. They had some technical difficulties and they weren't able to launch T-Rex, but they're hoping to do it this next summer. Coming across a little further, you see badly corroded deck winches and various other things. And here is the mainmast in the forward section of the ship, through which the people who go up to the crow's nest would crawl. This is about the width of a man. There's a ladder inside of it. This has fallen back onto the bridge of the ship during the sinking. And coming up here, you'll be able to see the crow's nest where the lookouts spotted the iceberg. There's quite a bit of cabling and other things hanging here. These pictures are being taken from a remotely operated vehicle called Magellan, which weighs about 3.5 tons and is being driven by a fiber optic cable from the surface in a ship. This is what's left of the little platform where the lookouts would stand, and this is the hole that they come through. The Olympic class of ships, there were 3 of them, like I say, were the largest ships built at that time. The first one, Olympic, actually went on to a long and glorious career. Several mishaps that I'll tell you about, but she served for 27 years, including as a troop ship during World War I. Titanic you know about. And the third was Britannic, originally called Gigantic, but I guess they figured they already ruined one word that means really, really big, so they called it Britannic. Britannic never saw passenger liner service. She was Her Majesty's hospital ship, HMHS Britannic, was commissioned in 1914 by the War Department, was turned into a hospital ship. On her 8th run to the front in the Crimea, off of an island called Kea in Greece, she was either torpedoed or she hit a mine and sank. It's interesting that after the Titanic disaster, Britannic was redesigned, bulkheads were raised, the ship was given an entire double hull, and the ship hit a mine, and we've seen the damage. We're actually doing a study on Britannic also. There's a 40-foot hole blown into the front of her, but no matter what kind of an idiot-proof design you put together, there's always some idiot that's going to undo it for you. They were in the middle of a shift change at 8 o'clock in the morning when they hit the explosion, and all of the watertight doors were open to allow the crew who were sleeping in the front to get back to the engine room in the back. So all the water flooded the entire side of the ship. When she started to list, unfortunately, you're in the Aegean Sea in August, it's hot, all the portholes were open. So it started to roll over, water came in, she rolled over and sank in an hour and a half. That was the telegraph you saw that gives engine commands to the room from the bridge. This shows you some of the corrosion and some of the degradation that's occurred over time. These window frames here are brass, so they're holding out much better. But up here, you see a lot of structures that are iron that have corroded away. The top of this particular room was also covered in teak. It's a wood that is very resistant to normal use in seawater. But you just see how this thing is just falling apart over time. Now, most of the corrosion is actually being turned into rusticles. That's a phrase coined by Bob Ballard when he first saw them. You can actually find rusticles not in the ocean. You can find them inside of water well pipes that are made of steel. Sometimes these get clogged with these structures. And in just a second, I'll show you what these rusticles look like when they break up. They happen to be filming here. He's 20 feet away, so what he's doing isn't disturbing the ship, but he happened to be here when one of these collapsed. And you can see how they just turn to dust and fall and create these piles of stuff going out from the side of the ship. But you can see how fine this stuff is. If you take a pound of rusticle, I'll go back to this. This is the forward expansion joint on the ship. There are two expansion joints which allow the ship, as it's sailing along, to flex in the top portions, not into the hull, but up in the upper portions. This is the forward one that broke as the ship was, as the bow was hitting the bottom. The back one is actually what broke and allowed the ship to break in half. So we're studying this to put into our model to see what was the stress at which this thing broke. This shows you some of the other things that we're looking for. This is a break in the side of the hull. You see one edge of one plate right here, and then there's a gap behind the one back here. And this is too high up to be iceberg damage. It's actually damage from when the ship hit the bottom. But this is the kind of thing that we're looking for to try and get some metallurgical evidence from the sinking. This is Natil. It's a submersible that is run by the French Oceanographic Institute, Ifremer. There are 5 submersibles that can reach Titanic today, 2 Russian, 1 Japanese, 1 French, and 1 US, Alvin. Others can reach Titanic, but they can't really do anything except look around. This is the main manned submersible that's used today to look at the Titanic, the other one being an unmanned box, Magellan. This is a model that was made from a bunch of photographs taken of the wreck, and when we did a flyby, we came up the bow, up this way, over the hatch, up the mast, up to this telegraph right here. I've been told recently that what we're trying to do is conduct an autopsy on someone who died of a head wound by looking at their feet. The damage to Titanic that sank her is actually 40 feet underneath this mud right here. And this mud has the consistency of liquid concrete. We need to see what's going on down here, and there are very few ways to do it. One way is to use what's called subsurface sonar. It's kind of like doing an ultrasound to try and see what the damage looks like under the mud. This is what everybody thought happened. This is from the London Daily Mail shortly after the sinking. Everybody figured in order for the great Titanic to have sunk, this bit of ice must have ripped a 300-foot-long gash down the side of the ship. No other way that this unsinkable ship could have gone down. People who knew metals at the time knew this was hooey. There's no way that ice, no matter how cold it gets, cuts 1-inch thick plate of steel. Might have punched a hole in it, but it certainly wouldn't have done this. One engineer from Harland and Wolff, the people that built the ship, his name was Edward Wilding, said, if the damage was 300 feet long and the ship sank in 2.5 hours, and we know how fast the rooms filled because we had guys standing down there watching it, he did a calculation and he said that this gash must have been 3/4 of an inch thick or wide. And he said the damage must have been in places, not a big cut. And the Mersey inquiry in England and the congressional inquiry in the United States both called him a lunatic. Problem was, he was right. He was the only one who was right. This is Paul Mathias, and he's hooking on the subsurface sonar onto Natil to go down and take a look at the damage under the mud. And what they found was not this great big hole ripped in the side of the ship, but 6 separations in the hull that happened to span the front 6 rooms on the ship. And these breaks lie right at the junction of where 2 plates would be. So we think it is plates popping open like this. If you add up all of those separations together, it's about as big as a door. And it's just bad, dumb luck that this last break goes 3 feet into this last boiler room. If Titanic had the front 5 compartments flooded, she was designed to stay afloat for about a day. If she had had the 4 front compartments flooded, she would have stayed afloat long enough possibly to make port in Halifax. But because this last break occurred, she flooded and sank in 2.5 hours. Now our naval architects get involved. This is Bill Garsky, the chair of our panel, and this is David Livingstone. He works for Harland and Wolff, the people that built the ship. They're still in business. A very distinguished shipbuilding company. They've done simulations of the flooding of the ship when you put this damage in, and you see how the water accumulates and how the ship goes down until you finally have breakage. One theory that we have found not to be true is the ice cube tray filling of water from one compartment to the next. There was claims that the design of the ship was faulty because the walls that made the watertight rooms didn't go high enough. So all the water had to do was fill and go over from one to the next and sink the ship. Well, it turns out by the time the water got to the top of the first room that filled up, there was enough water in the ship to sink it. It didn't have to go from one to the next, so the design was just fine. Didn't stop them from fixing Olympic and Britannic by extending the walls up. This is Roy Cullimore. He's our microbiologist, and he's done all the work on rusticles. Contrary to what has been reported, the Titanic is not being eaten by iron-eating bacteria. The bacteria are eating what they ate before the Titanic got there, stuff that filters down from above. What the rusticles are bacteria condominiums. They take the iron oxide that falls off the ship, turn it into another compound called iron silicate, and build these structures through which water courses in and out, and they get their food, and the bacteria live in these things. If you take a pound of rusticle, and I have some dried rusticle to look at up here, if you take a pound of rusticle and you take the surface of all the little tubes in it, it actually covers 13 acres. It's very, very spongy material, and you saw how it falls apart. Different materials behave differently when they're corroding or in that environment. The water down there is very salty. It is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It's under 6,000 pounds per square inch. If you want an idea of what that is, if you look at your thumbnail and you park 3 medium-sized cars on it, That's the pressure at the Titanic. The pressure pushing on the titanium sphere of Natil is enough that you can actually see, when you're in it, they tell me, you can actually see it get smaller as you go down. The front of this door of the safe is made of steel, mild steel. The plates and the fittings are brass. This is silver, and this is gold. And it turns out paper actually survives in some cases if it's contained inside of leather that has been tanned. Briefcases, wallets, that sort of thing. They can freeze dry it and they can recover it. So, metallurgy. In 1991, a piece of steel was recovered and tested up in Canada, and they found that what's called the fracture toughness, or the ability to resist a crack, was very, very low at the temperature of ice water. And the theory was put forth that the iceberg banged along the side of the ship and shattered the plates of steel like glass, and that's how the ship sank. So part of what we wanted to do was to look at this theory and see if it was right. So I've received a number of pieces of the ship. This is one of them that's sitting up here. If they give me enough of it, I guess I'll just put it back together. And we started looking at the steel using modern techniques. First thing we did was we just saw how strong it was by taking a bar of it and pulling it until it breaks. And we got strengths of about 40,000 pounds per square inch with, it got longer by 30% before it broke. These were almost exactly on the design specifications that Harland & Wolff had for material to go into this ship. Just fine. We looked at the chemistry. In steel, you have iron plus carbon, and you usually wind up with other materials in it, either due to the making of the steel, the smelting, the melting of the ore, these sorts of things. And you want to keep some of these, called tramp elements, as little as possible because they do nasty things to the mechanical properties. Sulfur is one, phosphorus is another. So in modern steel over here, you want to have this much sulfur, and the Titanic steel in the three measurements we have is a little high. And you want a fair amount of manganese. What manganese does is actually grabs onto the sulfur and keeps it from doing its nasty stuff. And it's okay, but it's a little bit low. And some of these other numbers are a little bit out of range for what you'd like for a modern steel. Keep in mind, these are specifications for today. The way we have tested the cracking resistance of the steel is you take, this is called a Sharpie bar, has this little notch in it. You set it down here and you hit it with a hammer, and how high up this hammer swings, or how high it started minus how high up it swings, is a measure of how much energy absorbed when it broke. And so we did measurements on our steel, and it shows that the toughness, the ability to resist cracking, is very low at 0 degrees. And this is the data from Canada, pretty consistent. And this is a modern steel where you see at this temperature, it can resist cracking a lot more. So, what causes this? This is what the steel looks like under the microscope. This is modern steel of the same composition as steel from the Titanic. And you see some differences. These dark phases are crystals of pretty much plain iron. It's called ferrite. These light phases are layers of this, plus another material called cementite. It's an iron and carbon, almost a ceramic. These guys are the manganese sulfide particles. This is what is made when the manganese grabs onto the sulfur and ties it up and keeps it off of the grain boundaries, the boundaries between the crystals where it can do a lot of damage. Now, this is the size in the Titanic steel. These little black things are the ones in modern steel. So you see how much more sulfur there is in the Titanic steel. Mild steel has been studied for about the last 50 years, pretty extensively for cracking. And there are some general things you can say about it. Large grains give you more brittle steel. Large layers in the perlite give you more brittle steel. So in general, there are some things about this Titanic steel that would tend to make it brittle. We've compared it to other materials. This is a piece of the Queen Mary. And you can see that the layer spacing is a little less, the grain size is a little smaller. These particles of manganese sulfide are smaller, so it's generally a cleaner steel. Now, if you break it and you look at the broken surface, you see something like this. These are little facets of broken crystal all over the place, but you also see this white area. This is actually where the steel stretched instead of cracked. Is about 5%, so there's a little bit of crack resistance in this steel. Now, another thing from the brittle steel theory was that these particles, this is a manganese sulfide particle, and it's broken, and it broke this crystal, and this little pearlite colony here, you can see the stripes in it. These guys start cracks in the structure all over the place. They grow together, and they make cracks that break, and having these guys in here that are so large makes the steel more brittle. Problem is, that's not true. Kind of a busy graph, but I'll explain it. This is the ability to resist a crack as you change the temperature. It goes from a very tough material, think of lead, to a very brittle material like glass, and it changes as you change the temperature. Now, if you start adding sulfur, the toughness, the ability to resist cracking, goes down, down, down. Problem is, the temperature we're interested in is over here. So you can add pretty much all the sulfur you want to, and it doesn't really have any impact, any effect in the toughness of the steel. What we think is actually more important, and is one of the reasons why we don't think that this steel theory is worth anything. Mild steel has a property called strain rate sensitivity. Think of silly putty. You pull silly putty slowly, it stretches. You pull silly putty quickly, it snaps. Same thing in steel. If you do a test like this impact test, which is a very high rate, you can imagine we're kicking samples all over the place, you get a temperature at which the steel becomes brittle, say is right about here. But if you load that crack much more slowly, it's actually quite a bit tougher at the same temperature. Now, we have a problem. What was the speed that all the damage occurred on the Titanic? We don't know what the shape was of the ice under the water when it hit. We have a pretty good idea of the angle that it hit the iceberg, but if you change that angle a little bit, the results change quite a bit. So this is something that we're currently working on. We do know that this impact test is okay for looking at railroad cars when they bang into each other in a switching yard. If something breaks, you figure that it's doing this. But we're in the process now. We just got some more steel. It was actually delivered this week to my office. We're going to run a test that's much slower and see how much this change is when you change the rate. I have a feeling it's going to be huge. And that is mainly, my suspicion comes from looking at the steel under the water. You see pieces that are bent and twisted all over the place. If you look at something like this, if this was as brittle as glass, that wouldn't have bent into a C over the span of about 5 inches. And it wouldn't have stretched like that when the crack hit the rivet hole. So I have a feeling that, yes, the steel was brittle when you hit it, but that's not relevant. Something else actually happened. Another thing that we've come across as we've been going along is rivet failure. We found some interesting things about the rivets that make us think that something is wrong about the way they were put in. We have testimony from people that survived the sinking. There's a guy named Barrett, who was a fireman, who went down into the damaged area of the Titanic and saw water shooting in through rivet holes. We have the evidence from the sonar that the damage seems to be breaks along seams. And also, if it was brittle steel, by looking at how the ribs go on the inside of the ship, if you hit the side of the plate, the crack should go up, and they all go sideways. We have some evidence from the Olympic, which, as you will see, has had a interesting career banging into things during the course of her life. And then we have some evidence looking straight at the metallurgy. Depending if you're a Navy man or not, the Olympic hit the Hawk or the Hawk hit the Olympic. In what's called the Solent, which is the area between the Isle of Wight and England, the Hawke was a heavy cruiser with an armored prow, and it hit the Olympic in the starboard aft, right about there, and punched a great big hole in her, like that. And there's a guy for scale. This hole is about 40 feet high. From a metallurgical point of view, this is a very interesting picture. Remember, Olympic was built right alongside Titanic from the same material, the same design, same techniques. Look at all these missing rivets, all the way around this hole. Some of these rivets are 15 feet away, and they've broken during this impact. Also, the edge of this crack right here looks pretty sharp. It looks like it cracked. But if you look down here, this looks pretty stretched and torn. So this gives us a little bit of indication that maybe there is a rate problem. Maybe when it first hit, it snapped a piece off, but as it pushed into the ship and slowed down, things started ripping and tearing. Just for completeness, it didn't help the Hawke any. Her nose was all bashed in, and her forward gun mount was knocked asunder, and she was scrapped. We've looked at some broken rivets. The rivets are made out of wrought iron, which is different from mild steel. Think of wrought iron as one of the oldest composites. It has a matrix of pretty much plain old iron, inside of which you have fibers of what's called silicate, which is called slag. It's the stuff that floats to the top of a vat when you cook iron ore to get iron out of it. What you do is you take good iron, put slag back into it in a process called puddling, where you have two guys that go at it with these rake-like things and draw these very fine fibers throughout the structure. You then take this, which is called a sponge, and you hammer it into whatever shape you want. And the fibers give the structure strength, where the iron, when it's pure iron, is actually fairly soft, gives it its flexibility. Now, when you draw out a bar to make a rivet, you take a bar out of the sponge, you make one head, you back it off to the length you want, you chop it off. And you just make rivets all day long like that. You send them out to the site. So the rivet, when it's having a head made, the slag, which is along the shaft here, because it came out of a hole, spreads out into the head like the branches of a tree. It's nice. But down here, where the other head used to be, the one that was installed when it got out to the works, is missing, and the slag goes sideways. When you think about wrought iron, you can compare it to a 2x4. If you pull a 2x4 in the direction of the grain, it's very strong. If you pull it perpendicular, right angles to that, it splits. Same thing happens with wrought iron. It's very strong in the direction of these slag fibers, which is what these are, and this is just iron. But if you pull it this way, you can imagine these guys all link together and make a crack, and the thing fails. When looking at these wrought iron rivets, we had a problem. What is good wrought iron for 1911? There was no definition. Wrought iron is iron with blah, blah, blah. I've looked and looked and looked, and I cannot find it. They define good wrought iron as if you take a bar that is 1 inch in diameter and 4 inches long, and you bend it, and the tips touch before it breaks, it's good. But you can imagine you can have anything in this thing, and it probably would do that. So we're having to look at old wrought iron from various places. I got 12 rivets from Doug Rees Evans from the Farmers Bank building in Pittsburgh, which was built in 1903 and was brought down a few years ago. It was the tallest building ever brought down with explosives. And I take a look at what does the slag look like in this stuff. And you can see the slag are nice little particles instead of these great big sheets. There's actually less of it. The slag in these rivets is about 1.5% to 2.5%, which is kind of what you'd like to have. The slag in some of the Titanic rivets are as high as 12%. This is one of the cases where a little is good and a lot is bad. We've looked at other ships, a ship called the Peking, and you can see nice little particles of slag. You like to have it in small little pieces rather than big sheets because the sheet gives you a piece of weakness. But if you want to look at a really crummy one, this is a ship that was made out of all wrought iron called the Wavertree. This marker here is actually 10 times bigger than the last one, so you can see these things with the naked eye. This was from a beam from the floor, and actually when it rusted with the salt water, these big flakes of iron would come off of the thing. It was quite crummy. So one of the problems was that there was too much slag in the rivets on average. Another is they're in these great big lumps rather than little particles like you like to have. And the third is this slag goes sideways down at the bottom. This is actually, I think, the most significant one, and I think it's because of the way they were installed. When you put the rivet in the hole, what you do is you put it in, I don't know if you've seen the old Bugs Bunny cartoons of rivets flying around in construction sites. You take a rivet out of a furnace, you put it in a hole, one guy holds onto it ordinarily, another person bashes a head onto it on the other side. As it cools down, it squeezes together. With these hydraulic riveters, they put a rivet in the hole and they squeeze it really quick. Now the problem is, when you're putting these things in by hand, there's a certain amount of time that it sits in the hole and it cools down. And so by the time you get done with it, it's not yellow-orange glowing anymore, it's actually dull blue. But with this riveting tool, it actually squeezes it on so fast that it's still orange hot when you finish up. So the problem is, this slag in this really soft, hot iron can flow around in the wrong direction, which wouldn't happen if you were hammering it at a lower temperature. So actually, the hydraulic riveter, we suspect, might be too good at what it did. It was too efficient. Now, there's another possibility that somebody brought up once. Suppose this slag turned sideways not because of the way it was installed, but because somebody ripped this head off and it just kind of smeared it that way. So we decided to smear some wrought iron. We took a core out of a rivet and we mashed it down like this, cut it off like a big wire cutter, and we looked at the slag, and it turns out the slag is all broken up in little pieces like this, which is very different from the other stuff. So we believe that it actually occurred while the rivet was hot, while it was being put in. And having the slag turned in that direction with a weak layer right there where the head meets the shaft would give that head a tendency to pop off when the plate is loaded. You can imagine having two rows of rivets along the edge, you hit the middle, it springs out, puts load on those heads, all the heads come flying off. That's what we think possibly could have happened as the iceberg hit along the side of the ship, is that rivets started popping and these seams started opening up. Now, just to give you a little comparison, 20 years later, in 1931, they built Queen Mary, and they no longer have a shaft that comes straight down with a head down at the bottom. They now drill it and have a nice taper and use a different material, so they have a very different type of riveting occurring in just a little bit further down the road. Now, we've considered a number of possibilities. It could have been a design problem, where we've looked at the height of the bulkheads, we've looked at the size of the rudder, we've looked at the responsiveness to steering, things like that. It could have been a metallurgy problem. The steel was too brittle. The rivets were bad. It could have been, and probably was to a large extent, bad driving. Now, people have a tendency to oversimplify things. They grab onto one problem, bad steel, had to be just bad steel, or it had to be just bad rivets or what have you, but it was actually a very complicated problem. It was a very complex ship that hit in a very strange way, bouncing down the side of an iceberg. And it isn't, the fact that it sank is not just because it hit something or it was built of a certain material or what have you. And you can see that when you look at Olympic. Sister ship of Titanic, built right alongside her. In her career, Olympic hit a few things. She hit the Hawk, or the Hawk hit her. She hit and sank the Nantucket lightship. She bounced into the Aquitania in New York Harbor and hit the tug that was pushing the Aquitania. She was hit by a dud World War I torpedo that actually put a dent in her and a crack down in the bottom. They didn't find it for a few months. Ran over the sub that fired it and sank it. This is what the propellers look like. Shoot it up pretty good. And the ship was scrapped in 1936 with the nickname Old Reliable. This is the sister ship of Titanic. And here she is being taken apart. So here we have two ships that are absolutely identical, except in a very small detail of one incident that they went through, that one had such a terrible disaster and failed in such a huge way, and the other one had 27 years of stellar service. So we're still continuing our investigation. We have looked at pretty much all the steel we think we're going to look at. We don't think that the steel was brittle because of observations from pieces we've recovered, because of some of the filming that we've done under the water that we've seen twisted and torn pieces. We don't think that was a problem. We are looking at rivets. I've looked at 27 rivets so far, and 14 have either too much slag or this orientation problem. Keep in mind that it doesn't take a big bunch of bad rivets to make a bad seam. If one rivet is bad and fails, the adjacent rivets get half of the load, or some fraction of the load that that rivet had, and you can get a phenomenon called unzipping, where this one breaks and all of a sudden, pff, these rivets may have been good, but they're all of a sudden above what they were designed to do. Also, if the high amount of slag in the wrought iron was because of variability from one batch to another, you only made this stuff about 5 tons at a time, you can imagine that all the rivets in one seam would be made from one batch. So you could have areas on the ship that have good and bad rivets. And you need to look at, okay, what's the chances that the area that got hit by the iceberg could have been bad? This is the big piece, so named by the salvors, that was finally brought up this summer. It's 2 stories tall, it weighs 20 tons. There's actually a porthole still attached to it with glass in it. And I get this piece right down here. I've looked at some rivets, like on bulkheads here, that have not broken. I've looked at some that have broken. There are differences. I need to look at more from the hull that have not broken to see if the ones we're looking at are just the crummy ones that are breaking and we're finding them on the ocean floor, or if the ones that haven't broken have a certain number that are bad also. So we need to work on the statistics. I've looked at 27 out of 3 million, so it's... All right, what conclusions can the scientists come with so far? We're having reservations that we're still working on things, especially the rivets. We don't believe any metallurgical mistakes were made in the construction of the Titanic. The materials that went into the hull, the steel, was state-of-the-art. It was the best stuff they could make. They didn't know that cracking in steel was a problem at low temperatures, and it is. That information wasn't discovered until Liberty ship failures, where ships would break in half during World War II, and they did a study, and in the 1950s they discovered that a crack in something that you're pulling on behaves very differently than something that you're pulling on without a crack in it. It's a field called fracture mechanics. The variability because of the small batches that went into the rivets, there's 300 tons of rivets on the ship, they made it 3 or 4 tons at a time. The variability from batch to batch may have had an impact into how the ship got the damage from the iceberg. We're yet to be looking at that. So we're looking at the rivets as an impact on the sinking. But the steel, we think, was fine. They didn't know that cracking was a problem. They didn't have the tools to measure it. And if they had known how to measure it, they didn't know how to fix it anyway. It's very important not to look at 1911 problems with 1998 knowledge. The design seems to be adequate in various things that we've looked at. There was no big glaring problem that they had. She's rusting at the rate of about 1 ton a day, and she will collapse into herself mainly within the next 20 years. So let me go back to the original question that I had. What sank the Titanic? It hit an iceberg. The metallurgical findings that we come up with are not going to change the fact that she sank, only possibly how quickly. If the rivets had, on average, been better, perhaps the damage might not have extended so far down the ship, because as the ship banged into the iceberg, the impacts got less and less and less severe, so maybe that last one would have held. It is not going to remove the irresponsibility of driving 22 knots through an ice field, or not having enough lifeboats on the ship. It's going to be in the details, not in the whether or not. And I'll throw this up. Public Affairs put this together for me. I guess that's supposed to be me. I've written a report with a large number of these results that you can download from my website if you want, or you can email to the Public Affairs Office and they'll send you a copy of it. And I'd be glad to take questions actually on any aspect from the expedition. Thank you.
The status of old rivets in general, like those in the Eiffel Tower, worry you? When they're 100 years old.
Not in general. I have seen rivets in things like fire escapes where they have corroded a lot and they're obviously loose. But most of those structures were very, very over-designed, and it's not a problem. There's someone over here?
When I read once when the Titanic sunk, when it broke in half, that actually the first part that was under the water pulled down the other part.
Right.
How did it actually break like that if the cracks were not vertically but they were horizontal?
During the final breakup, that was different from the damage that happened from the iceberg. You can imagine the front is loading with water and the stern raises out of the water. You've got 30,000 tons cantilevered on this top surface, and it's way beyond its design limit. That back expansion joint breaks, but what we've discovered is the bottom did not break all the way through, and the bow pulled the stern down a certain distance, and then it probably broke loose, and the stern righted itself, and then it sank.
But wouldn't if it was strong enough, wouldn't it stay stiff and it wouldn't bend like that?
I don't think you could have designed a structure strong enough to hold 30,000 tons in the water 300 feet out. It was just simply, even a lot of ships today probably wouldn't withstand that kind of weight.
How many hours did the Titanic sail before it sank?
She was about 4.5 days out. She was supposed to get to New York about a day after she sank, a day and a little bit. So she was about 3/4 of the way there.
What's an ice field?
An ice field? An ice field is a collection of icebergs. In the North Atlantic, they break off of Greenland mainly and float down into the Atlantic where they're caught by the jet stream, or sorry, the current, and they are melted as they're kind of thrown towards England, but they melt in just a few weeks once they reach that somewhat warmer water.
If they don't want to take it out of the water, Titanic, because they want it to rest in peace, and you said it's going to dissolve anyway, so what's the point in keeping it in the water?
What's the point of?
Of leaving it where it is and not like preserving it.
What we are doing is trying to figure out what happened to the ship. People who are doing salvaging of other things beyond what we need for our study, I don't really have an opinion on what they're trying to do, but what we're trying to do is just figure out what happened that night.
Yes, I recently purchased a magazine that was published in third quarter of 1911. I think it was Valentine magazine, and it has the famous picture of the Olympic and Titanic side by side.
Mm-hmm.
And it projected the launch date for the Titanic to be summer of 1912, and the Titanic to follow shortly thereafter. If they'd gone on schedule, it's likely they would have not encountered an iceberg, and the Titanic probably would have gone to a full life of regular service. There's nothing else wrong with it, correct?
It's possible that if it had just been a day earlier or 8 hours late, that particular year, the ice field reached much farther south than normal. Mm-hmm. And just a whole series of unlucky circumstances when people were manning radios, whether anybody was listening, whether ships paid attention to each other's signals, how fast they were going, but just amazing how all the bad luck lined up.
Did they accelerate the launch date then? It was really supposed to be much later in the year when it would have been much warmer weather, but did they advance it?
My recollection was the launch of Titanic was delayed because the damage to the Olympic, when she ran into the Hawk, she had to be fixed. And when she was brought into dry dock, some of the people that were working on Titanic had to be put onto Olympic.
I see.
So I'm not there's a little confusion about the dates.
Okay.
If people would like to queue up over here, what we're going to do is come along both sides of this table, and you can view the artifacts